Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. I hope you're all well, and I hope the kids aren't annoying you too much. If they are, don't worry, grab a glass of red, and we're about to learn about winter cleaning perennial grass pastures with Sandy McEachern. My name's Hilary, and I work with Holmes Sackett. So those of you who are new to the webinar platform, this is your control panel that should be at the top right corner of your screen. The red arrow on the left of this control panel collapses and reinstates it so you can get a better look at your screen. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you, so please type your questions in the box provided. Please make these questions as succinct as possible so I can relay them to Sandy at the end of the webinar. These webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. So you can, if you do have to run out of the room at any point, you can catch these on the MLA website at a later date. All right, just to introduce our topic presenter tonight, Sandy is a director and consultant at Holmes Sackett in Wagga Wagga. Holmes Sackett manages a farm benchmarking database that records production and financial performance of over 180 businesses from across southeastern Australia. Holmes Sackett provides a unique service that combines benchmarking data, farm economics and finance with the science or production systems to help clients improve their profitability and to grow their farm business. So without further ado, I will make Sandy the presenter and we'll get started.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight. I've, in preparation for this presentation, I've narrowed the content down a bit. My original was to look at winter cleaning perennial grass pastures or spray topping and spray grazing, and so thereby attacking all the annual weeds with different techniques. But in reviewing the literature that I could find in preparation for the presentation, I've realised that there's no way we were going to cover all three of those techniques in one presentation, one 20-minute presentation. So I've narrowed down tonight's topic to just winter cleaning perennial grass pastures. I'm coming at this topic from the perspective of I've got a perennial grass-based pasture that's got a level of annual weeds in it that I'm unhappy with, and I want to try and manipulate that pasture back to a better health or to get better production out of it using chemicals without the intention of renovating that pasture and starting from scratch again. And so I'm not trying to wipe everything out. All I'm trying to do is take out problem grasses, annual grasses out of the pasture, and thereby improve the productivity of that pasture. So one of the techniques available to me is commonly known as winter cleaning, and that's the topic I'm talking to tonight. So the things I want to cover in this presentation: what impacts do annual grass weeds have on our pastures? What is winter cleaning? You know, what am I talking about in terms of that technique? What needs to be implemented to make winter cleaning work, and what are the costs involved with winter cleaning? What are the risks, and when shouldn't I winter clean? So I want to cover some of the key areas where it could go wrong. What are the production benefits? And I'm taking that from the review of the literature that I can find on winter cleaning. And so I'm not an agronomist. I'm not going to be making specific recommendations on chemicals, brews, rates. All I'm doing is reviewing all the literature that's available and trying to condense that to get some key messages out of that literature about when I should be thinking about doing it, what production benefits I think I might get from it, but specific recommendations on what chemicals to use, when to apply them, will need to come from your own local agronomy service providers. So that won't be my role. And the thing I want to finish off with tonight is, if I'm going to go down this path and I'm going to start using chemicals to try and improve my pastures, to take annual grasses out of these pastures, how do I get longer term benefits out of that? So they're the topics I want to cover over tonight's presentation. In terms of winter cleaning, really what I'm talking about, as I've referred to, is the selective removal of annual grasses from a pasture by spraying during the winter months. And I'm talking about perennial grass pastures rather than, say, lucerne, for which you're going to have wider chemicals available to you, and the consequences of the use of those chemicals, because we really can take out any grass rather than just annual grasses, are going to be better understood. So what I'm talking about is trying to improve perennial grass pastures in this. These initial few slides, I'm going to refer to a study done by a fellow looking at what the cost of actually Vulpia, just one of those annual grasses, was to the wool industry. And I'm referring to that because they collated some industry data on just where the problems are with these annual grasses. So in that particular study, they looked at the area through New South Wales and Victoria where they considered the annual grass as a problem. I'm sure that that grey area would flow down into South Australia. I'm less sure about where that grey area would be in Western Australia, southern Western Australia. But one of the things I will note is that the further north you go and the more summer dominant your rainfall, probably the less winter annuals are of a problem to you. In fact, our weed in southern systems might be considered your pasture, valuable winter feed in a northern system. So really in this presentation, I am more focused on southern and eastern Australia, and perhaps it applies to some Western Australian pastures as well, and I'm sure some Tasmanian pastures as well. So in that study and through the collation of the data they had to do it, so their task was to assess the economic impact of Vulpia specifically. So that is winter fescue, rat's tail fescue. There's a few species of Vulpia. They put together what they considered the relative potential production of those grasses would be. And so in that study, they've said, well, if you've got a perennial grass pasture, or the perennial grasses in your district would do 12 tonne, then Vulpia specifically would do 10 tonne of dry matter production per year. Your annual legumes, sub-clovers, would do 8 tonne, and your broadleaf weeds would do 6 tonne. So really, the least productive species in the pasture is going to be the broadleaf weeds from a total production point of view. The annual grasses, and Vulpia only being one of them, may not produce as much pasture, total dry matter over the course of a year, but it's not to say they don't give you something in your pasture. And that's important to remember when we come to talking about the impact of trying to take them out of your pasture, understanding that actually when you do, you are going to impact the production of the pasture over the course of the year, and the total dry matter production is an important consideration. So we're not talking about a species, a grass that's totally unproductive. We're talking about trying to take out grasses that are less productive. In terms of when that production occurs, you can see from this graph, and the Vulpia being the grey line that peaks highest in September. In terms of monthly dry matter production, what we see with these annual grasses is that they tend to have very short, sharp growing periods, late winter, early spring, and then they senesce early and stop growing well before the perennial grasses would stop, well before some of your legumes would stop, and well before some of the broadleaf weeds would stop, but they're of less concern. So what we have by taking out the annual pastures is we're taking out early annual grasses, is we're taking out early production species through that winter period, and so that may come at a cost depending on the production system. In terms of understanding these graphs, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the exact dates there. I mean, obviously those dates will shift depending on your location. You know, you might be earlier season or later season depending on your rainfall, altitude, and where in the region you are. So these are the purpose of this graph is to demonstrate the relative between species, not specifically to identify exactly where those species grow best in what month in any given location. The big impact that the annual grasses have in terms of production is that because they grow fast and grow early, they also go reproductive early, and their digestibility drops off early. And so from that study that was done in 2009 on the economic impacts, their collation of data was that the Vulpia in particular would lose its digestibility very rapidly and a lot earlier than the annual legumes and the perennial grasses in the pasture. And so from mid-spring onwards, they are starting to lose digestibility, and by the time we get to late spring, they've got virtually no digestibility left. And so we've had a big flush of actually not bad quality feed, because the digestibility of those grasses is pretty good up until they go reproductive. We get that big flush of good quality feed, but then that quality drops off quite dramatically quite early. And then, with a lot of these annual grasses, and Vulpia being one of them, we have the seed issues that come with early senescence and can cause problems in the production system. So a large part of our problem with these annuals is the fact that they senesce early, the digestibility goes, they produce a seed that's damaging, and while they're doing that, they are thieving resources from more desirable species that may produce more over the course of a year, and also hold on to digestibility for a longer period of the year. So that's where they impact the system. In that particular study, the outcome was that they thought Vulpia itself was costing the wool industry specifically $30 million a year in that grey area. So based on those production differences, based on seed issues, and based on the prevalence of Vulpia, that was their estimate in that paper, that these grasses were costing $30 million a year to the wool industry. When we come to looking at what we can do about it, and again, we're hopefully avoiding full renovation of the pasture, which is quite expensive, not only from an input cost point of view, but from the opportunity cost of taking out a pasture for a year in order to do it. We're looking at this from the point of view of, how can we reduce the impact of these annual grasses, perhaps strengthen our perennial pasture base. And so what we need to consider with winter cleaning is, what is going to be the impact on winter pasture production? So if I take out a early growing and strong part of the pasture sward, what's the impact on my winter carrying capacity, which can be limiting in a large range of systems? We need to consider what the benefits to clover and perennial grass production will be overall, and we need to consider what the benefits, if any, will be from animal performance later in the season from taking out those annual grasses. So there's quite a few actually studies on using simazine and in different rates and at different times on Vulpia, and pretty much in all those studies what you find is that the timing of application is a trade-off between the herbicide effectiveness and the total dry matter reduction. And so what we're saying, well, what they're showing in these studies is if you go early, and in this case T1 is in May, T2 is in June, and T3 is in July. If you go too early, you miss out on the effectiveness in taking out the annuals, most likely because you've missed the full germination. So you've got a staggered germination of seed. You take out maybe a large portion, but not all of that germination. You also have more risk to other species in the sward, your clovers and perennial grasses if you go early. You get to June, you get quite a good result, and then once you get past that, later on, again, the efficacy of the application starts to drop away again. And so the timing of the application for a winter clean is really a compromise between best outcome for the knockdown of the weed we're interested in, which is in this case the Vulpia, and also leaving yourself with the most dry matter in the pasture. I've got to say that I haven't seen any trial result in reviewing the literature where a winter clean took out the total population. And so what we are looking at when we are doing one of these applications of chemical is we're looking at a control of the annual grass, of the Vulpia. We're not looking at an eradication of it, because the little bit we miss, given the seeds, the number of seeds that these grasses can produce, easily supplies the seed bank for the subsequent years. So no one's suggesting an eradication of the grass. Basically what we're talking about is trying to control it and the benefits from doing that. The other consequence of it is you'll get some compensation from particularly clover. So you take out the annual grasses out of the mix, and again, this is looking at Vulpia specifically in this trial, and yes, that will reduce dry matter production of your pasture sward, particularly in the winter, but as time progresses from when you sprayed, you get some compensation there, because some of these desirable species, either the clovers or the perennial grasses, you'll get more production out of. So in this particular trial, the arrow points to an unsprayed, the amount of clover in an unsprayed pasture, the amount of production in October, and then the columns to the right that are different levels of chemical and also different mixes of chemical. And so what you see is pretty much in all bar 2 litres per hectare of gramoxone, simazine plus 150 mils per hectare of gramoxone, you get a clover production benefit, and that benefit is replicated quite a number of times in quite a few trials that we see those benefits. So you can increase clover production, but I'm not saying you will increase total pasture yield. In most trials I've found where you get total pasture yield, what you see overall is a reduction. Hopefully, if the timing's right, from the point of view of minimising the damage of the chemical application, then the reduction can be quite small. But if you get it wrong, and also with some of the brews that have been tried, it can actually be quite large. And so one of the things with doing this is I think you do need advice from an experienced agronomist about what to do in what situation with regards to the chemicals that you're going to use and the timing of those applications, because it's not unreasonable to think that if you get it wrong, that you could severely reduce your pasture yield for the year, and then the cost will far outweigh any benefits you might get. So just as a guide to that, really the reduction in total dry matter yield is largely dependent on what percentage of your sward, or appears to be largely dependent on what percentage of your sward is those annual grasses that you are taking out. So if clover and perennials are only a low percentage of the sward when you decide to spray, and you spray out the annual grasses and take out a large percentage of the sward, then you won't get enough compensation from the individual plants that are left to make up for it. And the greater that discrepancy, the less chance you are of making up the difference. That's not necessarily to say you won't get a benefit unless it's really bad, but you just need to understand when you look at your pasture and what you think about doing, the worse the pasture is, the worse stated it is that it is in, the more compromise you will make in terms of winter production. In terms of impact on animal performance, there's a good trial that was done in 1998 that looked, this was at Rutherglen, and it looked at a winter clean in August, and then looked at what happened to lamb growth rates on those pastures. And so in terms of what those pastures looked like when they started, the unsprayed in spring had 80% annual grasses, and the sprayed had 50% annual grasses. So that late winter application to take out the annual grasses significantly reduced the amount of annual grass production over the spring period. And then the graph on the right shows the percentage of subclover that was left in that pasture. And so not only did it take out a lot of the annuals, but you saw a substantial increase in the percentage of subclover that was in the pasture. And then not only that, when it got late in the season, so out into December, that sprayed pasture had more green feed in it later. And I would suggest that's probably to do with the fact that there was less dry matter production early in the season, and perhaps more stored moisture over that spring period. So that pasture held on just a little bit longer. So in this trial, we had a dramatic shift in pasture quality from annual grasses, very little subclover, only 3% in the unsprayed, to still had annual grasses, but at a lot lower percentage, and a lot higher percentage of clover in the pasture, plus the pasture held on a little bit longer into the season. What did that mean in terms of animal production? Well, the lamb growth rates in the unsprayed were under 150 grams per day, and in the sprayed pasture they were closer to 200 grams per day. So we had effectively a 30% lift in lamb growth rate. If you put that at $8 a kilo dressed weight, that was an increase in $135 per hectare gross income. So even in a poor pasture, we can see that we can generate significant production gains from a winter clean. The big question is what happens next year in that pasture. So we've winter cleaned it in year one. You know, what happens in subsequent years, and there's been a number of trials that have tried to analyse how to get a permanent improvement in your pasture from this process. What these trials, I think, clearly show is that subclover is not a serious competitor against Vulpia or other annual grasses. So this trial here, which was at Wagga, compared a number of things, but one of them was different. They established pastures at different subclover seeding rates. So they increased the amount of subclover in the soil seed bank and at germination, and then watched what impact it had on composition of the pasture, and after trying to clean out the Vulpia. So they sprayed out the Vulpia, sowed subclover at different levels, and then watched what happened. And then on the fourth, there's 3 levels of subclover seed sown, 3 intensity sown, and then on the fourth system they implemented a rotational grazing system over the top of that. What you can see, the black in these graphs is the subclover, and it doesn't matter whether it was low fertility or high fertility, over that period of time, that subclover without the rotational grazing, the sub-clover was basically losing the battle to the annual grasses. So you couldn't sow enough sub-clover to take over the annual grasses. It was either holding or losing as a proportion of the sward, and that was independent of soil fertility. Where you implemented a rotational grazing system over the top of that, actually what we saw was the Vulpia content decreased, but it wasn't to the benefit of the sub-clover, it was to the benefit of other annual grasses. So in this case, soft brome. But it did give a clue that rotational grazing of some description may help in Vulpia, in the control of Vulpia, but it wasn't going to be to the benefit of the sub-clover in the sward. Then there were a few trials that looked at oversowing, and they've oversown with both annuals and perennial ryegrass. And so they looked at taking out the Vulpia with a winter clean and then oversowing either a perennial ryegrass or an annual ryegrass. The trial results I'm showing here are the perennial ryegrass. They were oversowing with perennial ryegrass, and you can see in these graphs, the top one, the percentage of Vulpia that was as a total of the dry matter was lowest when you had rotational ryegrass. So ryegrass oversown with winter cleaning, but in a rotational grazing system, or set stocked with ryegrass oversowing. So it showed that if you can get a competitive grass into the sward, it can help control Vulpia. It's not clovers won't, but other grasses, whether they be annual or perennial, if you can get them into the sward, they can help control the populations. If you just spray it, just using a winter clean, then you are going to have no long-term benefits. So spraying alone, winter cleaning alone is not going to give you any longer-term benefits from the chemical treatment, knocking out the seed bank. It's too good at recruiting from seed for that to be sustainable. So what we needed was some sort of rotation plus chemical manipulation to get long-term benefits. This particular trial, which was in 2009, looked at it with Fleurus pastures, and they got the same impact with the perennial Fleurus pasture, not oversown, but from increasing the perennial pasture component, or the Fleurus component. However, that came with what they called their rest period, but their rest period was quite extensive. It was from October right through till the autumn break. So it was probably quite an expensive rest period for the pasture. But again, they showed that they could keep populations of Vulpia down with chemical and strategic resting of the Fleurus pasture. So in that case, they did get some benefits in Fleurus content, which is shown in the top left graph there, but it came from chemical and a large rest. I'm not sure how easy it would be to replicate that Fleurus content increase in other areas or in other circumstances, whether that was quite unique to this particular trial, but it has been shown in more northern areas where we get more summer rainfall, that with cocksfoot the same thing has been achieved. So it would come down to probably an individual review of your own circumstances to whether you're likely to get much increase in perennial content. But the consequence of the increase in perennial content was a decrease in the sub-clover content. So we're really replacing problem annuals with hopefully more desirable annuals or more desirable perennials, but we're also probably reducing the sub-clover content as a consequence in the pasture. So from the review of the literature and the trials that have been done, the conclusions that I've come to are there are benefits to be captured from winter cleaning pastures, and they'll come from where the stock can utilise that improved pasture quality. And so there will be a cost in terms of overall dry matter reduction from that pasture, but where you're looking particularly at things like finishing lambs and specific purposes in the grazing system where you want livestock production late into the season, then I think that's where you're going to get your benefits within year. The cost benefit will be dependent a bit on how poor the sward is and how severely impacted it is by the spray and the chemicals used. But you know, even in that trial where it was quite bad, we can see that pasture quality can easily compensate that. Longer term, it's got to be part of an integrated approach, and that has to include oversowing a competitive grass species, or where you can, implementing a strategic grazing program that would manipulate the perennial content to take over, take over that space that those annual grasses are using. And that's it. Any questions?
Thanks, Sandy. Just to give Sandy a bit of a break before we jump into questions, if you do have to leave now, could you please take the time to answer the survey that'll pop up on your screen when you exit out of the webinar platform? This survey is just to make sure that MLA, Holmes Sackett, and the presenters that we get on to present hitting the right notes with topics and delivery. So if you're right to go, Sandy, just Dr. Peter asked a question about what about temperate pastures in northwest Tasmania. If you could just maybe elaborate on that question a bit, Peter, then I can flick it through to Sandy. The first question from Frank, Sandy: does the annual weed species depend on the season at hand? For example, this year the late rain resulted in an explosion in Patterson's Fleurus and the late flowering of serrated tussock. Would control of these impact the production of clovers and cool season grasses for winter feed? They're in the northern Monero, east of the Dividing Range.
Yeah, look, again, you would need to refer to specific local advice, but I haven't found a trial where your clovers weren't impacted to some degree with a selective herbicide trying to take, you know, problem weeds out. So I would be very surprised if we didn't have some impact from a selective herbicide, you know, the extent of that was, you're probably going to have to rely on local advice to be able to tell you that, and in context of what chemical you'll be using when you do it.
Thanks. And Frank, Paul wants to know, how long after winter cleaning can you sow annual or perennial ryegrass? Do you know?
I actually don't know the question to that. I can't remember whether it was stated in any of the trials. I would think, no, again, better refer to local agronomic advice, because if I stuff that up, that'd be a disaster.
No worries, thank you. Thanks, Paul. The next one from David. This has been focused on cleaning up of Vulpia. How comparable are these results to barley grass?
Yeah, good question. To be honest, I couldn't find any winter cleaning trials where they were targeting barley grass or soft brome or other annual grass species. I found some trial work for those species with spray topping, which is basically targeting those grasses when they go reproductive. So again, I'm not sure whether that tells me you can't tackle those grasses with winter cleaning, or whether that because Vulpia is considered a more serious problem, that's where the trial work has been focused. So I'm not quite sure, but certainly with spray topping, there were trials focused on taking out those other grasses.
Thanks for the question. The next one from Lewis. Thanks, Sandy. I might have missed it, but when using the oversow strategy, do you recommend an annual or perennial grass to help pasture outcompete weeds?
Well, the trials that have been done were annual ryegrass and perennial ryegrass. If you are oversowing, you would have to pick a species that is quite a vigorous seedling. So I'm sure you couldn't do it with Fleurus, for instance. So I suspect it wouldn't matter too much whether it was annual or perennial ryegrass because they're both reasonably vigorous seedlings. And if you could find any other grass that had a vigorous seedling, I'm sure it would work.
Thank you for the question. If there are any more questions, please send them through quickly. There has been a really good question come in here. I'll just do this one first. Peter, Dr. Peter, Northwest has, we usually spray out flat weeds in May. Would we be better to bring that forward and then spread fertilizer and seed together for maximum production?
I'm not sure. Again, I'm sorry, but you have to refer to local advice on that because I'm not sure. I can't take sort of the general advice, I guess, that I'm getting at, or the general trials work that I'm using, and apply it specifically locally. And we're really talking about the spray graze techniques, which we'll cover in a later webinar. So sorry, Peter, I cannot answer that question.
Okay, next one from Lisa. Did you see any impact of N on reducing Vulpia percentage?
I had one conversation with a research agronomist who indicated that he had actually done research on that and found that Vulpia particularly took a lot of N out of the system early in the season, but he had never published that research. So that was Jim Vergona up in New South Wales. So I think there is work that has been done on that shows, just the Vulpia particularly, and I suspect others, barley grass would fall into that category. They are thieves, and they do take nutrients from more desirable species and can have quite a big impact in that regard.
Jim's just written in and said guilty as charged. Next question from James. Sandy, does the data on control in subsequent years from winter clean change depending on the soil fertility of the pasture?
No, it had. So soil fertility alone in the trial work that I uncovered didn't protect the pasture from the invasion of Vulpia. What you needed, soil fertility only helped if it helped keep more desirable species in the population. So you needed those more desirable species in numbers. So you either had to recruit them through resting the pasture and recruitment either through seed or other means, or you had to recruit those desirable species by oversowing. So fertility on its own didn't provide a solution within the time frames that those trials went over, which was 4 or 5 years.
Thanks, James. Just a few more statements on the use of N. Graham would like to say that the percentage N correlated with the percentage clover dry matter, in that if you increase clover dry matter, you increase N fixation. So thanks for that, Graham. Any more questions to come through, please send them through quickly. No, that seems to be, just one more for you, Sandy. Great webinar, Sandy. This is from David. When does Hillary get a pay rise for all these late nights? It's not a promising chuckle.
I'm sure once we get over this virus, we can talk.
Yeah.
Hillary, just for those who are left listening, I think given the amount of technical questions that have come in regarding these techniques. What I might aim to do is just get a panel of agronomists together one night, one of these webinars, that we can answer a lot of those technical questions specifically and draw on experience. So I might try and get a panel from a number of different regions that we can do that. So
yeah,
that might help.
Another question that's just come through, Sandy, that I think would be good for you to touch on. With a poverty pasture, do you rate fertility a higher priority than winter cleaning?
With a poverty pasture, sorry, repeat the question.
I think it is, do you rate fertility a higher priority than winter cleaning?
Yes, I would. So I guess if I went back to my, priority list, it's grow more weeds and eat them, and then worry about the weeds you grow. So fertility addresses that issue. So better off growing more weeds, or significantly more weeds, and consuming them, and then worrying about the type of weed I grow. So the answer to that is yes, I would consider fertility a higher priority.
Yeah, great. A few suggestions. They really like the idea of the agro panel, Sandy. So we'll get that one in the works. Just another question from Charles, which might be for the panel when we get them together. Do I seed with more clover and annual ryegrass and attempt to spray again, or oversow or spread with fertilizer in April? I'm not sure that makes sense.
I think I know what the question's about, but again, I think we're going to be better off getting someone with a lot more experience on the ground than I do have to answer that, Hillary. So
yeah,
I'll pass on that one.
All right. Just another question, Charles, which I think might need to wait for the next webinar as well. Last year I sprayed a barley grass and subclover paddock with Verdict in August. It killed the barley grass but replaced it with silver grass. This year, what do I do?
Yeah, and that's the problem with just taking out the grasses. Then that's where we come back to, you've got to put something in there to outcompete them in subsequent years. And so you would have to look at the possibility of trying to do it with an oversowing of an annual ryegrass or perennial ryegrass, perhaps, depending on the region, to try and outcompete it in the long term.
Great. Next question from Tim. At what point do you cut your losses with poor persistence / annual weed problems and renovate pastures?
In my view, Tim, when desperate, it's such a high cost to renovate, and the large cost being the foregone production while you're waiting for your new pasture to establish. So and I think there is a point at which you can't, you're not going to bring a pasture back, and it's probably no point hanging on to it. But yeah, I think that's often quite a bit below where most people think it is in terms of how good that pasture is. I think if your soil fertility is very good, and I would count that, as I said previously, as my highest priority. I think if your soil fertility is very good, a lot of the even reasonably average looking pastures are still quite productive. And so, yeah, don't give up on them too early, I guess, would be my advice. Try and exhaust all those options first, because they are cheaper and a lot more cost effective.
Thanks for the question, Tim. The next one from Lewis. Any changes in strategy when targeting serrated tussock in pastures?
I can't comment. Don't know the answer to that.
Sorry, thanks. Lewis, maybe one for a later webinar. The next question from James. Sandy, should we be spraying out capeweed?
That's for the next topic as well. When we look at spray grazing, so no, we'll have to wait till I've researched it.
All right, thanks, James. From Lachlan, in Western regions with native pasture paddocks, is the cost of managing weeds such as nightshade regarded more a short-term priority, or is pasture fertility more important to focus on now?
I think pasture fertility should always come first. Soil fertility should always come first, in my view.
Thanks. So one from Bruce. Might be one for a later date. What is the trigger to get all Vulpia emerged, e.g. late or early break or temperature?
I don't know.
That's fine. One for a later date then. All right, just for those who have asked, these webinars are available for downloading on the MLA website under tools and resources. This webinar should be available by the beginning of next week, if not earlier. Otherwise, thanks very much for presenting tonight, Sandy, and we'll get on to the next session with you, which will be on spray grazing, and then followed by hopefully a agronomic webinar. Anyway, thanks very much, Sandy, and Charles would like to say well done.
Thank you. My pleasure.